day and welcome to the Best Talk series presented in the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences at Nelson Mandela University. My name is Hendrik Lloyd and I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you to our Best Talk series. This series is a new initiative within the faculty and it takes place on a monthly basis. The purpose and objective of this Best Talk series that every department will present a series of lectures on a monthly basis so as to showcase the various levels of expertise as well as fields of interest to the wider university and external community stakeholders. In that way, we can showcase our faculty and we can also introduce new contemporary topics and views on topics every month. I wish that you would join us every month for these talks and that you would enjoy it with us. I thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Alice Makochieng. Welcome to this talk. I'm from Nelson Mandela University. I'm based here in Port Elizabeth campus of Gqeberha in our Summerstrand main campus in 2nd Avenue. That's where my department is. I'm in the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences, and specifically the Department of Management Practice, where I've been a full-time lecturer for the last 9 years. Today I'll be speaking about a topic that is very close to my heart, which is bridging the digital divide. And the reason for this topic is I teach management as well as retail strategy modules. And one of the issues that we deal with is consumer behavior as well as internet marketing or multi-channel marketing or e-retailing or basically e-commerce. And I always like to bring a practical approach to my students' learning, and we've done a series of activities on digitalization and digital marketing. And to go back a bit in the background, before joining academia, I always say I'm a bit new to academia, or rather I joined academia late in that prior to academia, I worked in the private sector. I began my corporate career here in Port Elizabeth in the automotive sector, that is in 2004. And after the automotive sector, I joined a food manufacturing, one of South Africa's leading food manufacturing companies. So my background is in private sector and a bit in international development, but currently and all that experience, I brought it into academia. So I may have joined late, but I always like that my previous work gives me a different perspective that I bring to my students. So looking at the topic of digitalization and consumer behavior, how can we ensure that something that we take as an important part of our lives is not equally available to everyone? Or just come to think about it, can you live your life without the internet? In this day and age, can you live without the internet? In fact, when you look at the internet, it has become so pervasive and part of our lives that, according to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you put food, shelter, water, and clothing, and within those basic needs, you put Wi-Fi. And I don't know about your household, but in my household, if the Wi-Fi is down, just know that, oh no, everybody is unhappy. It's so important that we regard it nowadays as a basic human need. So I'm going to talk about this topic of digitalization and digital divide, in the sense that what we take for granted that is now part of human development is not available to majority and many of our population. I'm going to be talking about what is digital divide, define it and look at it, and then I will talk about the current investment scenario in South Africa regarding investment in the ICT sector, and then provide a way forward. And the current investment scenario will also include a discussion of the regulatory framework or regulatory policies regarding foreign investment. Okay. So basically, digital divide is a term that is used to describe the gap between individuals or countries that have access to information technologies, primarily telecommunications and the internet, versus individuals or countries that do not. So it's the divide between people who have access to the internet and people who don't have access to the internet. That's the divide. And surprisingly, that gap is big in some countries, and in some countries, developed, advanced countries, that gap is almost negligible. But here in South Africa, we have a big digital divide, especially for a middle-income country. So what are some of the factors that contribute to this digital divide? Number one is geographical location, urban areas versus rural areas. Rural areas do not have well-developed infrastructure as far as internet services is concerned. And then secondly, it is income, the rich versus poor. The internet is expensive, especially data. So we are grappling with a situation where especially the poor and poor households do not have the financial means to have internet. And gender, surprisingly, and this is also, the numbers are close, but there is a disparity. Men versus women. Men tend to be more well-skilled in the internet and digital products compared to women. And especially here when we are talking in the African context and South African context. Age, the younger people are more astute versus old people. You can also see it in your own house when you're sometimes fumbling with your digital gadgets. You'll actually ask your children. They know it better than you. So the young people, they're almost inborn with digital skills. And in the workplace, we are confronted with many older generation who don't have the skills for this new generation of internet products, as well as our consumers. And ethnicity and race, this is particularly pertinent for South Africa's environment. Majority of Black people live in areas that are infrastructure deprived, so therefore, in terms of just race barriers and ethnicity, we see those stark differences. And then lastly, language and literacy. Most of the internet communication is in English, and therefore some people are excluded because they're not skilled or well equipped to communicate in the language of digitalization. Okay. So, having looked at those scenarios and those factors, you can see that as South Africa, nearly all these factors that I've just discussed touch on the South African society. So, given that scenario, our current environment in terms of digital access stands like this. As per 2026, 79% of South Africa's population have some form of internet access, meaning that 79% is good, but it means 21%, or roughly 13 million people, still remain offline. As in offline, they do not have access to internet. And these are mainly people in the rural areas. And then regional disparities within South Africa itself still exist, also exist. And in Gauteng, for example, Gauteng is the economic powerhouse of South Africa. You can see in Gauteng, 86 to 87% of Indian and white residents have some form of home internet. In contrast, only 39% of black households in Gauteng have access to internet. So that's a big disparity even within just one province. So despite the emphasis on South Africa's government wanting to promote ICT for development, and ICT is also one of Millennium Sustainable Development Goals. However, over the past 30 years since democratic transition, this goodwill has not translated into concrete policy and action on the ground. And in fact, it has fallen short in fostering equitable digital inclusion. So as a country, there's need to bridge this gap of digital exclusion. And particularly in rural areas, they particularly remain digitally excluded. This limits e-commerce, it limits education expansion, it limits digitalization of government services. So the impact of digital exclusion are dire, in the sense that we are going to have a very well-developed first-class urban areas, and then we have a big section of the population that is digitally excluded. And this was even apparent during COVID, when we saw that poorer households and schools could not transition to online learning as easily as urban and richer schools could. So we actually had some sections of school children in South Africa who were digitally excluded. When we had the pandemic, because of digital exclusion, they actually were falling behind or remained behind in their learning. And you can see that the areas that were digitally equipped continued. So this already is a big disparity that needs to be filled, so that things like this do not happen or do not become part of our consumers' and residents' daily lives. In order to close this gap, there is a need to put investment on the ground in terms of digital infrastructure. So while some progress has been made to increase internet access in South Africa from 64% in 2011 to the current levels of 79% that we are seeing in 2026, there's still a huge gap in this divide, especially if we project and hope that the country takes a meaningful leap into the fifth industrial revolution. The ICT is an important and an enabler to that digital revolution. Infrastructure gaps particularly are such a big hindrance, and the basic infrastructure in rural areas is a major cause of this disparity. And historically, the country developed in such a way that large parts of the rural areas were left behind in terms of development of physical infrastructure, and those disparities have not been closed. However, the government is working hard to reduce these infrastructure gaps, and recently, as recent as in April, the government secured investment commitment of over $500 million from BlackRock. Remember, BlackRock, they were in Cape Town, and that was a big investment meeting that was led by the president. And this $500 million US dollars is dedicated towards South Africa's infrastructure spending. Of this spending, the government is committing 940 billion rand that will be put into public infrastructure over the next 3 years to boost energy security, rail, port capacity, and last but not least, digital infrastructure. So over the next 3 years, we hope to see a reduction in this digital divide, but this is a long-term investment that would still require more time. There are big impacts of this infrastructure gap. One of them is the economic impact of the infrastructure gap that we have in digitalization. It means that South Africa, as a middle-income country, still largely remains a country with one of the highest cost of data, even amongst the BRICS countries, and also one with the amongst its peers with the lowest internet penetration. And it means that significant number of consumers cannot afford or cannot access digital products. And also low access and usage. Even the people who have the 79% that are mentioned that have access to the internet, most of this access is actually through intermittent devices like mobile phones, smartphones, rather than reliable on-the-ground fiber. Remember, Microsoft had a saying that a computer in every home. The vision of fiber is actually that everyone should live 5 meters to a fiber, like your home should be 5 meters close to a fiber. But every home, we know that every street has not been dug, is not connected to the internet. So reliability of internet is still a factor, as people are connected to the internet, but on mobile devices, but not on reliable, stable, high-speed home connectivity. So this hinders transmission of digital skills and digital learning, which can actually even reduce the gap of unemployment and upskilling of our youth. And we also have still rural to urban divide, which I showed you the numbers in Gauteng. For rural communities, for example, on average, only 1.7% of households in South Africa have access to reliable internet services. And if you think of it, that majority of our population still live in rural areas, or a considerable number of South Africa's population live in rural areas, it means that these households are excluded digitally from participating on what is going on in the world. A snapshot of South Africa's digital access per province, and you can see there that the Western Cape and Gauteng rank as the highest in terms of digital penetration and digital access, and other provinces are catching up, but we would like to see more of a higher uptake or higher inclusion. Okay, the investment regulatory climate at the moment. So given this infrastructure gap and given these disparities that we have, what is the regulatory environment that can foster investment into this sector? The ICT is a critical sector. So, and one of the President Ramaphosa's big audacious ambitions is actually to attract investments of 1 trillion into South Africa over the next 5 years to bridge not just infrastructure gaps, but to be a conducive country that attracts investments. So in short, South Africa needs investment to fill the digital divide in ICT infrastructure. And against this backdrop, it is also a given that every government has its own economic policies that regulates the country's investment requirement that investors must follow. For South Africa, for example, one of the investment requirements that foreign investors need to abide by is 30% ownership, relinquished 30% ownership of their entities to local previously disadvantaged groups. And this is, in short, this is called the BEE requirement. While BEE is important as a policy that fosters socioeconomic development in the country and is an important part of equalizing the playing field, in many ways it has also stood as an impediment to investment, in that unpacking how that BEE requirement must be actualized has become sometimes untenable, and it has brought a stalemate in some situations. So the government has paved a way for the BEE element to be fulfilled using what we call, where investors, foreign investors, can participate in what we call equity equivalent investment programs, or EEIP. And especially in the ICT sector, this waiver has been important. There's some multinationals that have actually come and invested. We have many multinationals in South Africa in the ICT that have been able to harmonize their investment in South Africa using this equity equivalent investment programs. And however, this waiver is not uniform, and that is where the contention comes in. Okay. Recently, in the last few months, Starlink, the satellite internet division of Elon Musk's SpaceX, is reportedly, or has reportedly been willing to invest 113 million US dollars, which is roughly 2 billion rand, using their technology, the low Earth orbit satellite technology, in short called the LEO technology. And this is internet that is transmitted via satellite technology. It also requires Starlink, of course, to invest in on-the-ground infrastructure and data centers that will work together with this satellite technology. So it's a massive investment in terms of satellite as well as on-the-ground infrastructure. It looks good that it can be a leap towards filling the infrastructure gap. However, the contention comes when it comes to the operationalization of this potential investment. Starlink has made it very clear that Starlink is willing to invest in the country provided they secure a license. In order to secure a license, they must meet, on the other hand, in order to secure a license, they must meet all the requirements, including BEE. And this is where it gets tricky. Starlink is not willing to relinquish ownership and has proposed an equity equivalent of roughly 27 million US dollars to bring connectivity to 5,000 South African schools as well as police stations in rural areas. However, the government is adamant that the BEE local ownership for Starlink must be met. In other words, we have a stalemate, or the government and the potential investor have reached a stalemate. The government has rejected Starlink's equity investment equivalent proposal, and both parties are currently in what I call an investment climate over the BEE issue. And hence, the title of this talk, part of the title of this talk, to BEE or not to BEE. So the investment stalemate is over the BEE issue. And usually, when one appraises a large-scale investment of Starlink scale, one looks at things like, can you deliver? Yes, Starlink can deliver because the LEO technology is second to none. Can you scale? Can the investor scale? Yes, Starlink's economies of scale are massive and global, so that's not an issue. Delivery and scale is not an issue for Starlink. The contention becomes on the third question, can you partner? And this is categorically no. This is the issue where the contention comes. So apart from the BEE, the local mobile operators as well are not keen to have Starlink as a direct competitor, but as a backhaul to their broadband operations. And the government, on the other hand, would also listen to local mobile operators. You've been here, you've invested, you've employed people, you are on the ground, and to bring in a massive big competitor also requires the government to navigate that path and the relationships that it currently has. So the BE is the main contention, but as well as also accommodating local mobile operators. So, and Vodacom, for example, has expressed that they welcome Starlink and as a partner to actually be, they would be happy with Starlink as a partner that to partner on their broadband operations, and not necessarily as a direct competitor, which is understandable. So where to from here? What is the way forward? The way forward then is we need the investment. And the current policy uncertainty does not foster investment. BE in its current form, while it fosters socioeconomic development in the country, it scares investors. And the investment equivalent proposals that have been made, their implementation have not been uniform as well. So the government needs a harmonious, consistent regulatory environment to foster faster FDI inflows. And both parties, specifically SpaceX Starlink and the South African government, need to stop the political investment grandstanding. If you look at the government of national unity, they must also speak with one voice. When you look at what the Minister of Communication, Honorable Solly Malatsi, proposed, he proposed actually new changes and gazetted those new changes that were going to ease the policy in the ICT sector to ease investment, which basically would have made it easier for Starlink. However, the government regulator in the ICT sector, ICASA, sees things differently. So what the Minister of Communication wants differs from what ICASA wants, the regulator. So this has created a scenario where the government of national unity is speaking with a forked tongue, and a forked tongue approach is not conducive for investment, especially in the critical ICT and telecommunications sector. In closing, the government alone cannot reduce this digital exclusion, and to close the gap, we need investors. And therefore, the government must remove rhetoric from the investment agenda. And Starlink must not assume special favors. I know they've been saying like, we're son of the soil. No. It is important that the approach that Starlink uses is also where they don't make onerous demands or inflammatory political statements, because a confrontational approach will not help any party. Perhaps in my proposal, an investment commission is needed to smoothen South Africa's regulatory investment policies so that the government speaks with one voice. And this being African Month, May is Africa Month, I will end my talk by saying investment, or rather money, does not like noise. So I hope the rhetoric can go down so that we can attract the needed investment for infrastructure expansion in South Africa to close the digital divide and bridge it so that we can all move forward in a more equal manner and make digital products and digitalization accessible to many citizens and consumers. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. And as Nelson Mandela University we say, we are here to change the world. Thank you.